Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Reservoir Dogs, starring Harvey Keitel, Steve Buscemi, Tim Roth, Michael Madsen, Chris Penn, Lawrence Tierney, and Quentin Tarantino himself, and directed by Quentin Tarantino, and written by as well. So, before I get into this movie, I got a couple of things I need to bring up. One, why am I doing Quentin Tarantino? Well, I'm leading up to his new movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And two, I'm going to do only his directing and writing movies from all the way up to leading up to that movie that I'm going to release it for, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So, I know this movie when I was small. I never seen it till, I don't know, maybe later in my life. And I remember liking it back then, and what do I think of it now? Well, let's get into it, shall we? The movie starts us off at a diner with Larry, aka Mr. White, played by Harvey Keitel, Freddie, aka Mr. Orange, played by Tim Roth, Vic Vega, aka Mr. Blonde, played by Michael Madsen, Mr. Pink, played by Steve Buscemi, Mr. Blue, played by Edward Bunker, Mr. Brown, played by Mr. Quentin Tarantino himself, Nice Guy Eddie, played by Chris Penn, and Joe Cabot, played by Lawrence Tierney, telling stories about something Mr. Brown made up, and suddenly Mr. White steals a book Joe reads for 15 minutes straight. And Joe takes care of the check, and the rest of the guys tip, and Mr. Pink says he doesn't tip and because he doesn't believe in it. And I love the conversations these characters. It makes me get to know them very well. Maybe with an exception of a couple people. That's what I love about Mr. Tarantino. He lets us get to know these characters very well. Mr. Orange is shot off screen in the stomach. Well, it will be on the screen later on. And panics about it. But Mr. White tells him to calm the fuck down. And he tells him he's going to be okay. And takes him in a warehouse and tells him Joe is going to heal him. And I'm really enjoying these characters and being around them as I'm caring about them. Mr. Pink arrives and says some fucking setup. And we're told by Mr. White that Mr. Brown is shot by the cops off screen. And what a brilliant way to kill off Mr. Brown, your own character, Mr. Tarantino. I mean, really, it's brilliant. Mr. Pink tells Mr. White that he was chased by the cops and runs into a car and steals a woman's car and forces her out and shoots the cops. And I love the action sequence because it's so fast-paced. This is the only movie directed by Mr. Tarantino that's the shortest, because the other ones are either 2 hours or sometimes 3 hours long. And this movie is 100 minutes long. This is the quickest movie you're going to see by Mr. Tarantino. Almost every movie by Mr. Tarantino as director has us go through by chapters, and we start with Mr. White, and he discusses with Joe in a flashback the idea and how they can pull off the job, and how he used to be a team with Alabama. And I'm thinking of True Romance, which I'll talk about, only written by Mr. Tarantino and directed by a different director, when I'll talk about next week, which is very interesting, because I keep thinking that might be Patricia Arquette's character in True Romance, but let's keep going. Mr. White and Mr. Pink fight Mr. Blonde, and Mr. Blonde fight, and Mr. Blonde comes in completely not scared about what happened, but does capture a cop and puts him in his trunk, and we move on to the next chapter called Mr. Blonde. And Mr. Blonde visits Joe about the job, and Nice Guy Eddie comes in, and he's glad to see him. And the next thing you know, they're wrestling, and Eddie says Mr. Blonde, he tried to fuck him. I found that really motherfucking funny, to the point I busted up my motherfucking ass. I really think Chris Penn reminds me of Jonah Hill, who I'll be seeing in Django, and puts Mr. Blonde in Long Beach, California, because this movie is set in Los Angeles. Don't ask me how I know that, I just do. And the next thing you know, we move on to Mr. White, Mr. Blonde, and Mr. Pink beat up the cop, and Mr. Tarantino does violence very well. Nice guy Eddie gets Mr. White and Mr. Pink outside with him, and Mr. Blonde tortures the cop, and cuts his ear off with a fucking razor, and I thought, that's gotta fucking hurt to death. And we see Mr. Orange shoots Mr. Blonde. For what reason? Because he's a cop and doesn't tell anyone until later at the end of the film. And that was a twist I did not see coming from this movie. Great job, Mr. Tarantino. Mr. Orange is the next chapter, and the final chapter, I must say. And we see him before the job. He's an undercover cop and reads a 4-page script and meets Joe for the first time. And goes into the bathroom and sees 4 cops plus a German Shepherd dog barking at Mr. Orange, which did feel pretty damn intense. They call Mr. Orange down for the job. Then, while his cop buddies follow them, then I've got a feeling from the first Guardians of the Galaxy goes on the radio. And I'm enjoying the car ride with Eddie, Mr. White, Mr. Pink, and Mr. Orange while they go through the job, and how it's supposed to work, and the script is working very well. Then we get back to present time, and Eddie and Mr. White and Mr. Pink come back to shoot the cop. And then Joe comes in to tell the rest Mr. Orange is the cop. And go Mr. Blue and got Mr. Blue killed. Joe, Eddie, and Mr. White have a Mexican standoff, and Joe, Eddie gets shot as well as Mr. Orange, and Mr. Pink escapes, and Mr. White hangs on to Mr. Orange, and as the cops come in and to shoot Mr. White, and that as an ending works for tragedy reasons, but it's a good ending in my opinion. Now it's time for the rating. I'll give this movie a 9.0 out of 10. This movie works very well for a first-time director, and I really care for the characters. The script works very well, and I absolutely love the conversations these characters have. And for a first-time director, Mr. Tarantino has a future in his career to make something great. And I hope Once Upon a Time in Hollywood would be that case. So I would like to thank you guys for joining me, and next week I will be back with Mr. Tarantino writing True Romance. And until next time, and action.